The news broke like thunder. A monarch declared unfit. A kingdom shaken to its core. And at the center of it all, Prince William stepping into a role no one expected him to take so soon. Imagine the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders as whispers filled palace corridors. The king can no longer rule. What happens to a monarchy when its sovereign is stripped of his crown not by choice, but by health? That's where our story begins. Think about it for a moment. What if the man groomed for the throne his entire life, finally wearing the crown after decades of waiting, was suddenly told he wasn't well enough to fulfill his duty? It's not just heartbreaking. It's destabilizing. The monarchy thrives on continuity, on stability. But doctors don't respect tradition. They respect truth. And the truth, they said, was that King Charles III was medically unfit to rule. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't just about a father and son. This is about a nation's identity. Because when a king falters, the ripples travel far beyond Buckingham Palace gates. They shake Parliament. They stir the people. They change history. The declaration left the world stunned, but inside the palace walls, the shock was even greater. And William? He wasn't just the heir anymore. Overnight, he became the center of power. Now pause here. Ask yourself, how fast can the crown shift in Britain? We've seen abdications before. Edward VIII chose love over duty and left his younger brother to reign. But this wasn't about choice. This was about health. No resignation speech. No carefully worded farewell. Just a blunt medical assessment that sent Charles's decades-long dream crashing down. Picture the scene. Doctors gather quietly in a paneled room of Clarence House. Their faces pale, their words carefully measured. A few aides stand by the door, whispering nervously. The air is heavy, as though everyone knows they're on the verge of saying something that cannot be unsaid. When the verdict is delivered, His Majesty is unfit to fulfill his duties. The silence is deafening. A silence that carries the weight of centuries of monarchy. And William? He's summoned almost immediately. He walks in not just as a son, but as the next king. That's the moment it hits him. This isn't a rehearsal anymore. This isn't about preparing for a far-off day. It's happening now. His father, the man he once looked to for guidance, is being declared too ill to serve. And with that, the crown tilts in his direction. But let's not pretend this was smooth. Oh no, the announcement might have been framed as a matter of health, but the politics around it were brutal. There were whispers. Was Charles really that ill? Or were advisors nudging the narrative to make way for a younger, stronger monarch? Think about it. A monarchy always needs public confidence. And Charles's reign, brief as it was, never fully commanded the devotion that his mother did. Could it be that declaring him medically unfit was as much about optics as it was about health? This is where Camilla comes in. Imagine her position. For decades, she fought against public disdain, slowly clawing her way into acceptance as queen consort. And now, she's sidelined in one swift blow. No regency. No stepping in while Charles recovers. Just humiliation. The crown skips over her and lands directly in William's hands. That must have stung deeper than any tabloid headline ever did. But here's the irony. The public, many of them, cheered. They saw William and Kate as a fresh, stable pair. A couple who represented the future. And they saw Charles and Camilla as relics of the past. For them, the doctor's announcement felt like destiny. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. Because even as William stood poised to lead, he was still grappling with the weight of what it meant to take his father's place while the man was still alive, still watching, still capable of reminding everyone that he had been king. Now let me ask you, can you imagine the strain inside the palace at that moment? Family dinners suddenly turned into power plays. A father and son caught between love and rivalry. A wife watching her life's ambition crumble before her eyes. And an entire nation asking, what happens next? The press had a field day. Headlines blared with words like unfit, crisis, and shock. Cameras zoomed in on Charles's weary face, analyzing every wrinkle for signs of frailty. Meanwhile, William's every gesture was dissected. The set of his jaw, the steadiness of his hand. Was he ready? Was he strong enough? The people wanted reassurance, and William had to deliver it, even while still reeling himself. But behind those headlines lay deeper contradictions. Some doctors said Charles's condition could be managed. Others insisted his health was simply too unstable for the grueling schedule of a monarch. Which was it? Was this a genuine medical emergency? Or a carefully staged maneuver to transition power while the institution still had public sympathy? The truth may never be fully known, and that's what makes this moment so haunting. And in the middle of it all, William had to make a choice: shrink from the spotlight or step into it. He chose the latter, because he had no other option. And that, right there, is what separates heirs from kings. The moment you stop waiting and start ruling. Now, don't forget, this wasn't just a private family drama. This was constitutional. Parliament had to be informed. Advisors scrambled to prepare statements. Clerks dusted off centuries-old protocols to navigate something most had only studied in history books. The machinery of the monarchy whirred to life, adjusting with almost mechanical precision. But behind that machinery were real human emotions. A son watching his father fall. A wife watching her power vanish. A nation watching its history shift overnight. Think about the symbolism. Charles spent over 70 years as heir, the longest in history. He endured scandals, ridicule, and decades of waiting. Finally, he became king, and within a blink, doctors said, no more. It almost feels cruel, almost scripted by fate to remind us that the crown is never truly secure, no matter how long you prepare. And this brings us to the cliffhanger moment. Because while the announcement was shocking enough, it was what came next that truly shook the monarchy to its foundations. You see, the doctor's report wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much darker. Because behind closed doors, whispers began to spread. Perhaps the report had been influenced. Perhaps Charles wasn't as unfit as the world was told. And perhaps someone, maybe even someone very close to him, wanted William to rise sooner rather than later. And that, my friends, sets the stage for the drama that unfolded next. A drama of betrayal, ambition, humiliation, and power. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace was silent. Too silent. Not the usual hum of staff bustling about. Not the sound of polished shoes echoing across marble floors. Not even the gentle murmurs of aides whispering over papers. No, this silence was heavy, suffocating. The kind that makes you wonder if something unspeakable has just happened. And it had. Behind closed doors, the doctor's report had landed like a thunderclap. King Charles was medically unfit to rule. Now here's the question. How do you tell a nation that its sovereign, a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for the throne, was too ill to wear the crown? Do you soften the blow? Do you hide the truth? Or do you say it plainly, risking panic and scandal? The palace wrestled with that dilemma in real time, and everyone knew that whatever came next would alter history. Picture it. A chamber lined with wood, portraits of kings and queens watching from the walls like silent judges. The air is tense, aides avoiding eye contact, courtiers shuffling papers nervously. The doctors sit at a long table, the weight of centuries of monarchy pressing down on their words. Then the verdict falls. His Majesty is medically unfit to fulfill his duties. Those words cut deeper than any sword ever could. William was summoned almost immediately. He wasn't just the heir anymore. He was now the focal point of a monarchy in crisis. Imagine walking through those palace halls, knowing that in mere minutes, your life will change forever, not because you wanted it, not because you asked for it, but because duty is calling. Let me ask you directly, what would you do in that moment? Would you hesitate? Would you grieve? Or would you stand taller, knowing the eyes of the world were already on you? William didn't have the luxury of hesitation. He walked into that room and saw his father's reign crumbling in real time. And yet, in that same moment, the crown began to shift toward him. But it wasn't just William who felt the shock. Every person in that room understood the implications. Advisors exchanged looks of disbelief. Courtiers who had once sworn loyalty to Charles now whispered about William. Even the staff, the cooks, the drivers, the footmen, could sense the change in the air. This wasn't just another day at Buckingham Palace. This was the day the monarchy trembled. The middle of the palace's crisis played out like a Shakespearean drama. Charles himself, weary and pale, reportedly resisted at first. He had waited longer than any heir in history for his crown. Was he truly ready to give it up after just a short reign? Or did he believe, perhaps stubbornly, that he could still rule, even as his body betrayed him? That contradiction, The king's will against the doctor's orders tore through the palace like a storm. Now, here's where it gets even more dramatic. Camilla. Imagine her face when the announcement was made. For decades she had been the shadow, the other woman, the scandal. Slowly, she climbed into acceptance, eventually crowned queen consort beside her husband. And now, in an instant, that hard-earned power was slipping through her fingers. The doctor's words didn't just end Charles's reign. They erased her influence in one cruel stroke. Think about the humiliation. Camilla wasn't asked to step in as regent. She wasn't given a chance to hold things together while Charles recovered. No, she was bypassed. Completely. The focus shifted to William, the young and steady heir, and to Kate, the woman the public adored. For Camilla, it must have felt like history mocking her all over again. And yet, outside the palace, the world only saw the surface. Headlines screaming, Charles unfit to rule. Crowds gathering at the gates, some weeping, others cheering. The monarchy, built on centuries of continuity, was suddenly unstable. A nation that prided itself on tradition was now watching that tradition unravel in real time. But inside those walls, the tension was unbearable. William stood frozen between two worlds, the loyal son and the destined king. His father, alive yet diminished. His stepmother, furious yet powerless. His country, waiting for reassurance he wasn't sure he could give. It was the kind of burden that would break most men. But William didn't have the option of breaking. Let's pause and consider. Could this have been prevented? Some claim Charles's condition had been known for months. That aides whispered about his fatigue, his unexplained absences, his lapses in energy. Yet the palace, as it always does, cloaked it in secrecy. Protect the monarch at all costs. That's the rule. But what happens when secrecy collides with reality? You get a moment like this, sudden, shocking, destabilizing. And don't forget the irony. Charles had waited 70 years for the throne, longer than anyone in British history. He endured ridicule, scandal, and a lifetime of being overshadowed by his mother. Finally, he was king. And now? Now he was being told, barely into his reign, that he couldn't go on. Cruel doesn't even begin to describe it. For William, though, this was more than just a constitutional shift. It was personal. How do you take your father's place while he's still alive, still watching, still perhaps resentful? How do you comfort him as a son while stepping past him as a king? That contradiction sat heavy in William's chest. And yet, even as he struggled, others in the palace began to circle. Advisors, politicians, even foreign diplomats. They weren't looking at Charles anymore. They were looking at William. And he could feel it. But let's not forget one more piece of this drama, the people. Because while the palace struggled with its silence, the nation roared. Social media lit up. News anchors speculated wildly. Some mourned Charles, saying he had been robbed of his rightful reign. Others cheered, saying this was destiny, that William and Kate were the future the monarchy needed. It was a split, a fracture in the public opinion, one that mirrored the fracture inside the palace itself. And here's the real kicker. The announcement wasn't even the most shocking part. No, what truly stunned everyone was what followed. Because once the doctor's report was released, once William began stepping into the spotlight, new whispers emerged. Whispers that maybe the report wasn't purely medical. Maybe it had been influenced. Maybe someone wanted this transition to happen sooner rather than later. Which raises the ultimate question, was Charles really too unfit to rule? Or was this the most calculated palace move in modern history? And as William stood at the edge of his new role, uncertain and unprepared, one thing became clear. The drama was only just beginning. Because what came next would pit family against family, loyalty against ambition, and truth against secrecy. But what happened in the very next hours? The moment William confronted his father face to face would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Was this truly destiny? Or was it betrayal dressed up as medicine? That's the question that haunted William as he walked into the room where his father sat, pale and weary, a king whose reign had been reduced to whispers of unfitness. Imagine the weight of that moment. A son approaching his father, but not as a child seeking advice, nor as a prince seeking approval. No, he approached as the man about to take everything his father had waited his entire life to claim. William's steps echoed across the polished floor. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Advisors stood stiff against the walls, their eyes flicking between father and son like spectators at a duel. And at the center, King Charles, his face lined not only with age, but with humiliation. How does a man who waited 70 years for his crown accept that it is being pulled away, not by death, not by abdication, but by a doctor's ruling? William stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. Can you picture it? The silence, the tension, the unbridgeable chasm that had suddenly opened between them. Then, finally, Charles raised his head, his voice strained but clear. Is this what you wanted? That question cut deeper than any official declaration. Was this what William wanted? To ascend early? To carry the crown before his time? Or did he still wish for more years with his father as king? To learn, to observe, to prepare? Inside William's mind, the contradictions clashed violently. He never asked for this, but he couldn't deny that the nation was looking to him now, not his father. And then came the moment of reckoning. The Privy Council was convened, the ancient body that advises the monarch. They gathered swiftly, their robes and traditions wrapping the crisis in centuries of weight. The doctor's report was read aloud. His Majesty the King is deemed medically unfit to continue fulfilling the duties of sovereign. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And though Charles was alive, it felt as though his reign had died right there. William felt every eye on him. Every cough, every shuffle of paper, every raised eyebrow seemed to whisper the same thing. You're the king now. But he wasn't crowned yet. He wasn't anointed. He wasn't ready. Yet the machinery of monarchy does not pause for feelings. It moves forward with or without you. And what about Kate? Imagine her watching her husband, knowing that the moment they had both dreaded and prepared for had come years too soon. She had been steady, supportive, the quiet strength beside him. But now, as advisors leaned toward William and asked him to take charge, she must have felt the same weight. Their family's life would never again belong to them. Now pause. Let's consider Camilla. The woman once despised by the public, slowly rehabilitated into the role of queen consort. For her, this was the ultimate humiliation. She wasn't asked to step in as regent, even temporarily. She wasn't given a moment to hold on to the throne in Charles's stead. No, she was pushed aside entirely. Can you imagine the fury simmering behind her polite smile? For decades she had endured scorn, clawing her way into the crown, and in a heartbeat, she was irrelevant. Reports say she left the chamber in silence, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, every step like a drumbeat of rage. If she spoke, it wasn't recorded. But those who saw her face said it all. She felt betrayed, discarded, humiliated. Meanwhile, William was thrust into action. He didn't have time to process. He didn't have time to grieve. Advisors were already briefing him on protocols. What would he say to the nation? When would the public announcement be made? How would Parliament respond? The crown was already pressing down on his head, even though it hadn't officially been placed there. And let me ask you, what would you do if you were William? Would you cling to your father, insisting he remain king as long as possible? Or would you accept the burden, knowing that hesitation could shatter the monarchy's fragile image? William chose the latter. Because deep down, he knew the monarchy wasn't just about one man. It was about survival. But survival came with a cost. Because as William nodded his agreement to step forward, Charles's face fell. In that moment, the father was eclipsed by the son, the king by the heir, and their relationship, strained already by years of distance and difference, cracked further. Outside, the press had caught wind of the whispers. Cameras lined the gates, flashing as cars sped in and out. Crowds began to gather, some holding flowers, others shouting questions. Is the king dying? Is William taking over? The speculation spread like wildfire. By the time the official statement reached the public, the story was already bigger than the palace could control. The announcement hit the airwaves. Following medical advice, His Majesty King Charles III will no longer carry out the duties of sovereign. The Prince of Wales will assume these responsibilities until further notice. Did you catch that phrasing? Until further notice. A deliberate choice. It suggested hope, a possibility that Charles might recover. But everyone in that room knew the truth. Once a king is declared unfit, there is no going back. The crown never moves in reverse. And as the world reeled from the statement, William found himself alone in his study later that night. Papers spread before him, advisors' words echoing in his ears. His father's voice, pained and accusing, still lingered in his mind. "Is this what you wanted?" And William, staring at the crest of the monarchy stamped on every document, had no answer. But what he did have was resolve. The people needed a king. The monarchy needed stability. And he would not let it crumble, not on his watch. Still, lurking behind every decision, every speech, every camera flash was a shadow. A shadow that whispered, was this orchestrated? Was Charles truly unfit? Or had someone, somewhere, decided that William's time had come sooner than fate intended? And as William prepared to face the nation the following morning, one more unexpected confrontation awaited him, a meeting that would ignite an even greater storm inside the palace. Was this the end of her influence? That's the thought that echoed in Camilla's mind as she sat alone, the announcement replaying over and over in her head. For decades, she had fought tooth and nail for legitimacy. She had endured years of being branded the villain, the other woman, the scarlet letter attached to the heir to the throne. And finally, she had been crowned queen consort. But in one swift, brutal moment, that title seemed hollow. Because when the doctors declared Charles unfit, no one turned to her. No one asked her to hold the monarchy together. They all turned to William. Humiliation has a sound. In Camilla's case, it was the silence that followed her exit from the council chamber. Her heels clicked against the palace floor, sharp, rhythmic, like a warning signal. Aides avoided her eyes. Courtiers pretended to busy themselves with papers. Everyone knew she had been sidelined, and no one dared to acknowledge it. For a woman who had clawed her way from public scandal to royal acceptance, this was the deepest cut of all. But let me ask you, did Camilla ever truly believe the crown would embrace her? Or did she always know, deep down, that when push came to shove, she would be seen as expendable? The public may have softened over the years, but the memory of Diana still hovered like a ghost. For millions, Camilla was tolerated, not adored. And in this moment of crisis, tolerance wasn't enough. The monarchy needed someone it could rally behind, and that wasn't her. Still, humiliation can breed fury, and fury can breed desperate moves. Palace insiders whispered that Camilla was livid, her temper boiling just beneath the surface. She reportedly demanded to see the doctor's reports herself, as if hoping to find a loophole, some wording that would allow her to step in as regent. But the words were clear: Charles was unfit. And with that, Camilla's power evaporated. Imagine her watching William step forward with quiet confidence, the public already rallying around him, and Kate. The contrast must have been unbearable. Kate, graceful and admired, standing beside her husband as though born for the role. Camilla, by comparison, looked like a shadow, irrelevant, dismissed. And yet, Camilla was no fool. She knew palace politics well enough to realize she still had cards to play, allies in certain corners, journalists willing to listen to her version of events, old friends in parliament who could whisper doubts. If she couldn't hold the throne directly, perhaps she could disrupt the man now stepping into its spotlight. But here's the irony. While Camilla stewed in humiliation, much of the public cheered her downfall. Social media erupted with comments like, "Finally, karma for Camilla," and "It's William and Kate's time." Hashtags trended worldwide, celebrating what many saw as poetic justice. The woman who once broke a marriage was now watching hers crumble under the glare of history. Still, the monarchy doesn't run on public sentiment alone. Behind the scenes, Camilla began strategizing. Could she appeal to Charles himself? Convince him to resist the medical verdict? Could she quietly push advisors to slow William's rise? Or was this, in truth, the final chapter of her long and controversial royal journey? Meanwhile, Charles, weakened and humiliated, seemed unable to shield her. Their partnership, once so defiant in the face of criticism, now looked fragile. Some even claimed that Camilla's anger made Charles's decline harder, that her refusal to accept reality added weight to his already crumbling authority. Was she protecting him, or was she simply protecting herself? Now pause here. Think about the contradictions. Camilla had spent years trying to prove she was more than a mistress, more than a scandal. And yet, when the crown was at risk, no one trusted her with power. It was William, the son of Diana, who now carried the hopes of the monarchy. The irony is almost too sharp to bear, and it begs the question, did William feel a sense of poetic justice too? Did he, even silently, think of his mother in this moment? Diana, wronged and humiliated, watching from beyond the grave as her eldest son took the throne earlier than expected, while the woman she once despised was cast aside. If so, William never said it aloud. But the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Camilla's next moves were crucial. Would she fade quietly into the background, content with whatever ceremonial scraps remained? Or would she fight, clawing for relevance one last time? Those who knew her suspected the latter, because Camilla had never been one to surrender without a fight. And fight she did, though not in the way many expected. She didn't storm into William's chambers. She didn't call a press conference. Instead, she began to whisper. Little suggestions here and there. Questions raised to confidence. Isn't it odd that the doctor's report was so absolute? Do we really know the full truth about Charles's condition? She didn't need to shout. All she needed was to sow doubt. And in the fragile world of monarchy, doubt can be as dangerous as disease. But while Camilla plotted in the shadows, William was stepping into the light. Every gesture, every word, every glance was scrutinized by a nation desperate for reassurance. And as William grew into his unexpected role, Camilla shrank in comparison. The humiliation deepened. Still, a humiliated queen can be dangerous. And though she smiled for the cameras, though she nodded politely at official gatherings, behind closed doors she was already planning her counterattack. Because in her mind, this wasn't the end. Not yet. And her next move, whispered to a trusted ally, would ignite a fresh firestorm inside the palace. What medical truth could dethrone a king? That's the question that hung over the palace like a storm cloud. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't an abdication, it wasn't even a political coup. It was the cold, clinical verdict of physicians, men and women in white coats with stethoscopes and charts, speaking words that weighed more than crowns and coronets. Doctors, not dukes, had clipped the reign of a monarch. And that in itself was extraordinary. The report was blunt. No royal flourishes, no gentle phrasing to soften the blow. His Majesty is medically unfit to continue performing the duties of sovereign. That single line carried centuries of consequence. Imagine reading that aloud in a palace chamber where portraits of strong rulers, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Victoria, looked down from gilded frames. Kings and queens who clung to power until death. And here was Charles, not dead, not abdicating, but declared too frail to serve by medical decree. Now pause and think. What did the doctors see that made them so certain? Was it a visible weakness, trembling hands, faltering speech? Or was it something hidden, a diagnosis sealed in medical files the public may never see? Some sources whispered it was his heart. Others suggested a neurological condition. The palace never confirmed. And that vacuum of truth became the perfect breeding ground for speculation. This is where history becomes haunting. Because Charles wasn't the first monarch to face the question of fitness. Cast your mind back to George III. The king remembered as mad. His declining health and mental state sparked whispers, parliamentary interventions, and eventually, the regency of his son. The monarchy survived, but it was scarred. Now, centuries later, another king was being measured by the cold standards of medicine. His fitness debated not in whispers, but on the front pages of newspapers and trending hashtags. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Some insisted the diagnosis was genuine, that the doctors were acting purely in the interest of the nation. But others weren't so sure. Was Charles truly incapable? Or was this convenient timing for those who wanted William on the throne sooner? Doctors, after all, can be pressured. Reports can be shaped. And in the shadowy world of royal politics, the line between medicine and manipulation blurs very quickly. Ask yourself this. If a monarch's health is failing, who benefits most from declaring him unfit? Certainly not Charles. But what about those circling him? Advisors eager for a younger king, politicians wanting fresh royal energy, even family members with ambitions of their own. The very idea makes the mind spin. Still, the public didn't get the details. They only got the headline. Charles unfit to rule. And in that absence of detail, contradictions multiplied. Some tabloids claimed Charles was bedridden. Others showed photos of him walking, waving, even smiling, suggesting he wasn't nearly as fragile as painted. Which was true? Were we seeing a man on the edge of collapse or a king forced into exile by carefully chosen words? And what about William? His every move now seemed symbolic. If he smiled, the press called it confidence. If he frowned, they whispered about the unbearable weight he carried. Yet behind his steady public face, imagine the questions he must have asked in private. What exactly did the doctors find? Why now? Why so absolute? Because if there's even a shred of doubt, it changes everything. Kate, ever composed, reportedly urged him to trust the process, to accept the doctor's judgment as fact. But William wasn't just a son anymore. He was becoming the king, and kings cannot afford blind trust. He needed to know if this was truly about health or if palace intrigue had wrapped itself in the cloak of medicine. And here's the irony. The doctors, in their attempt to provide clarity, had actually created chaos. Their report was so stark, so final, that it raised more questions than answers. If Charles was too unfit to sign documents, how could he be well enough to deliver a heartfelt statement to the nation just days later? If his health was fragile enough to end his reign, why was he not in hospital under constant care? The contradictions didn't add up. That's the cruel twist. The medical truth was meant to stabilize the monarchy, to give William a clear mandate to step forward. Instead, it opened the door to suspicion, conspiracy, and division. People didn't just ask, "Is Charles okay?" They asked, "Was Charles pushed?" And once that question takes root, it never goes away. Think of the scenes in Parliament, where whispers spread among MPs. Was this really about health, or was it about control? Think of the palace aides, scrambling to keep a lid on leaks, terrified that one stray document could expose the raw details. And think of Charles himself, sitting in his chambers, perhaps feeling betrayed not just by his body, but by the institution he had waited a lifetime to lead. And through it all, Camilla's silence grew louder. She knew the doctor's report spelled the end of her influence. If Charles could not reign, neither could she, which made her one of the few with the fiercest incentive to question the diagnosis. And question it she did, behind closed doors, in hushed tones, planting seeds of doubt wherever she could. But here's the question that gnawed at William. If the doctor's words weren't entirely about health, then whose words were they echoing? Because just when he thought he understood the gravity of his father's condition, a secret file landed on his desk. A document that suggested the medical story might not be the whole story. And what that file revealed would leave even William questioning whether his father had been dethroned by illness or by design. Who really wanted Charles out? That's the question that sliced through the palace like a dagger. Because when you strip away the official statement, the carefully worded press release, the somber tone of the doctor's declaration, one truth remains. Someone benefited from this. Someone wanted Charles gone. And that someone may not have been fate or illness, but flesh and blood figures inside the very walls of power. The monarchy, for all its pageantry, is also a battlefield. Courtiers, advisors, politicians. They all circle the crown like moths around a flame. Some seek stability, others seek advantage. And when a monarch falters, the vultures swoop. So let's ask the real question. Was Charles simply too unwell to continue? Or was he nudged aside by forces who preferred a younger, fresher, more popular king? Think about it. Charles never commanded the kind of universal devotion his mother did. Queen Elizabeth II was a symbol, almost untouchable, revered across generations. Charles, by contrast, carried baggage. Decades of scandal, whispers of unpopularity, lingering resentment over Diana. His reign, though legitimate, was never universally embraced. And in a world where perception can make or break a monarchy, did that make him expendable? Consider the advisors closest to the crown. Men and women whose careers depend on the monarchy's survival. They had to look ahead, to ask themselves, who will keep the institution alive in the 21st century? A king in his 70s, battling health concerns and public skepticism? Or a younger prince with a beautiful wife, photogenic children, and the aura of stability? To them, the answer may have been obvious. And yet, this isn't just speculation. Palace insiders whispered that a group of senior advisors had been meeting quietly for months, long before the doctor's announcement. Their topic? Succession, not in the distant future, but sooner, much sooner. They worried about Charles's stamina. They worried about his image. And most of all, they worried about the monarchy's relevance in an era where public support cannot be taken for granted. So when the medical reports began to surface, did those advisors seize the opportunity? Did they amplify the concerns, push the narrative, ensure that the doctor's verdict was absolute? It's not a stretch to imagine. After all, politics often hides behind the mask of medicine. Now let's bring Camilla into this. For her, the loss of Charles's reign meant the loss of everything she had worked for. If there was one person desperate to keep him on the throne, it was her. And that made her the odd one out. Because while others saw William as the future, she saw him as the end. Her allies were few, her power shrinking by the hour. And that desperation made her dangerous. Meanwhile, William himself wasn't blind to the whispers. He could feel the subtle pressure of expectation, the advisors leaning in, the politicians warming to him, the public already embracing him as the true monarch. But here's the contradiction. William never asked for this moment to come early. He wasn't scheming behind the scenes, yet he was the greatest beneficiary of the shift. And that fact alone would fuel endless suspicion. And then came the most shocking twist. A letter. Not a modern email, not a digital memo, but a handwritten letter slipped discreetly into William's possession. Its author? An anonymous insider who claimed to have knowledge of the doctor's deliberations. The letter suggested that the medical ruling wasn't unanimous. That some physicians believed Charles could continue with a reduced schedule, while others insisted on removal. And what tipped the scales, according to the letter, wasn't medical evidence at all. It was political pressure. Can you imagine William's face as he read those words? The realization that his father might have been dethroned not purely by illness, but by calculation? That his own rise, which he wanted to see as destiny, might instead be the result of palace intrigue? It must have chilled him to the bone. But what do you do with such a revelation? Expose it, and risk unraveling the monarchy entirely? Or bury it, accept the crown, and carry the burden of a truth you can never speak aloud? That's the impossible choice William faced. And as if that weren't enough, the whispers grew louder beyond the palace walls. Newspapers began publishing op-eds asking whether the monarchy had staged Charles's exit. Social media buzzed with theories. Some said it was William himself, others blamed Parliament. Still others believed it was orchestrated by foreign interests eager to see a younger king on the throne. The contradictions multiplied, and with them, public trust eroded. But the most dangerous whispers weren't in the press. They were in Parliament. Behind closed doors, MPs debated not only the king's health, but the integrity of the process itself. And if Parliament questioned the truth, the monarchy's very foundation trembled. And so, as William prepared to take the throne, he knew he wasn't just inheriting a crown. He was inheriting a storm of suspicion, betrayal, and manipulation. A storm that could drown the monarchy if he didn't navigate it carefully. And the first test of that storm came swiftly, when divisions inside the royal family themselves began to crack wide open. Because loyalty, as William was about to learn, is the rarest currency in the House of Windsor. Who do you trust when your own family begins to splinter? That was the question William faced as the monarchy itself seemed to fracture before his eyes. The moment Charles was declared unfit, loyalties began to divide, and the once united image of the royal family cracked open like porcelain dropped on marble. Some still clung to Charles, insisting his reign was not yet finished. Others, quietly but firmly, shifted their allegiance to William. And just like that, the monarchy became a house divided. Imagine the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace. Courtiers who had once bowed deeply to Charles now measured their gestures, uncertain whether to curtsy to Camilla or shift their gaze toward William. Staff whispered in corridors, speculating on who would hold the true power tomorrow, next week, next month. Every gesture, every word was scrutinized. The monarchy thrives on unity, yet now, unity was gone. And here's the irony. This wasn't new. The House of Windsor has always been a family of fractures. Think of the abdication crisis of Edward VIII. Think of the tension between Elizabeth II and her rebellious sister Margaret. Think of Charles and Diana's implosion in front of the entire world. History shows us again and again, when royal families divide, nations tremble. And now, it was happening all over again. Charles had his defenders. Longtime courtiers who had served him for decades refused to accept that his reign could be snuffed out so easily. They argued that the doctors were too harsh, that Charles could still serve in a reduced role. These loyalists saw William's rise not as destiny, but as usurpation, even if unintentional. And behind closed doors, some of them whispered words that bordered on treason. He is still the king. But William had his camp too. Younger aides, fresh-faced advisors, even certain politicians who had grown tired of Charles's slower, more traditional ways. They saw William as the embodiment of renewal, the face that could keep the monarchy relevant in the digital age. To them, Charles's decline wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity. Now, ask yourself this. What happens when half a family bows to one king and half to another? The answer is chaos. And chaos, in the monarchy, is dangerous. Because the moment the public senses division, the institution begins to wobble. And then came the dinners. Picture it. A long oak table in Buckingham Palace, silverware glinting under chandeliers, plates filled but appetites absent. Charles at one end, William at the other. Camilla stiff and furious. Kate poised but watchful. The air thick with silence, broken only by forced pleasantries and the clinking of forks. One evening, Charles reportedly slammed his glass down and muttered, "I am not finished." William didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. The symbolism was undeniable. A father and son, not allies, but rivals in all but name. And yet, William didn't want rivalry. He wanted stability. But stability was slipping through his fingers as quickly as sand through an hourglass. The press, of course, seized on every crack. Headlines screamed, "Royal rift widens, divided House of Windsor. Who is really in charge?" Photographs of Charles looking frail were printed beside images of William standing tall, the contrast impossible to ignore. For the public, it was becoming a question not of if William would take the throne, but when, and at what cost to his family. But perhaps the most painful fracture wasn't between Charles and William. It was within the siblings. Because lurking in the background was Harry. And though he was oceans away, his silence was deafening. Some expected him to defend his father, to criticize the speed of William's rise. Others thought he would stay quiet, nursing his own grievances. Either way, his absence only deepened the sense of division. Inside the palace, aides began whispering about succession battles not just for the throne, but for loyalty. Who would stand with William? Who would remain with Charles? Who might even be tempted to side with Harry if he re-entered the fray? It was a chessboard with too many moving pieces, and William was still learning the game while the world watched. And then came the breaking point. During a private council meeting, one of Charles's oldest advisors openly challenged William's authority. He argued that the king should retain certain ceremonial duties, despite the doctor's report. His words carried the sting of defiance. And in that moment, William faced his first true test as monarch in waiting. What do you do when someone questions your legitimacy in front of an entire room? Do you lash out, risk looking insecure? Or do you remain calm, prove your authority without a word raised in anger? William chose the latter. He sat silently, let the man finish, and then, with steady voice, reminded the council that the decision had already been made, and that he was acting in the best interest of the monarchy. It was firm, controlled, and final. But the damage was done. The divide was out in the open. Half the room nodded in agreement with William. The other half avoided eye contact, their loyalty still tied to Charles. The monarchy was officially at war with itself, even if that war was waged with whispers, glances, and silence instead of swords. And just as William began to navigate this fragile balance, another storm brewed on the horizon. Because if Charles's loyalists were dangerous, Harry's looming silence was a ticking time bomb. And when Harry finally broke that silence, the cracks in the monarchy would shatter into full-blown fractures. What does a sidelined prince say when his brother takes the crown? That was the question on everyone's lips as Harry remained silent while the world spun around the monarchy's biggest upheaval in decades. His father had just been declared unfit to rule. His brother was stepping into power earlier than anyone expected. Camilla was humiliated. Parliament was buzzing. The press was frothing. And Harry? He said nothing. But sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Imagine the scene in Montecito. Meghan pacing the living room, phone in hand, reading headline after headline. William preparing to take the throne. Charles described as frail and broken. Camilla reduced to whispers of irrelevance. To Meghan, it was vindication. To Harry, it was torment. Because for him, this wasn't just politics. It was blood. It was family. His father was being sidelined. His brother was ascending. And he was thousands of miles away, watching it unfold on a screen. Now, ask yourself, what would you do in Harry's shoes? Would you defend your father? Speak out, criticize the speed of William's rise? Or would you stay quiet, fearing that any word you uttered would be twisted, weaponized, and splashed across front pages? Harry's choice was silence. And in that silence, suspicion grew. The British press filled the void with speculation. Tabloids screamed, Harry snubbed by Palace. Will Harry defend Charles? Meghan plots while William rises. Some commentators suggested Harry was secretly furious that William would now wear the crown. Others claimed he was relieved to be free from the burden himself. But no one truly knew, and that made the silence unbearable. Behind closed doors, aides debated whether to brief Harry formally on Charles's condition. Should he be summoned back to London? Should he be included in the family's private discussions? Some argued yes. After all, he was still the king's son. Others argued no. He had chosen exile. He had chosen California. He had chosen to distance himself from royal duty. Why should he be brought back into the fold now? And here lies the contradiction. Harry had left the institution, but he had never left the bloodline. His name, his position, his very existence meant that every decision still involved him, whether he wanted it or not. Now let's not forget Meghan. For her, this was opportunity. She knew silence creates narratives, and narratives create power. Reports swirled that Meghan urged Harry to hold back, to let the story play out, to position themselves carefully when the moment was right. But Harry, caught between love for his father and distance from his family, struggled. Imagine the sleepless nights, scrolling through endless coverage, wondering, should I say something? Should I fly back? Should I let William carry it alone? And then came the whispers. Some claimed Harry had privately called Charles, expressing his support. Others said he hadn't spoken to his father at all, that their relationship was too fractured. Which was true? No one could say for certain. And that uncertainty only fueled the storm. But here's the irony. While Harry remained silent, William's every move was amplified. Crowds cheered him. Parliament praised him. Advisors leaned on him. The public narrative shifted. William the steady, William the strong, William the rightful. And in that light, Harry looked like the absent one. The prince who left. The son who wasn't there when his father fell. That perception cut deep. Because Harry, for all his rebellion, still loved his father. Still cared for the man behind the crown. And yet, the world saw him as detached, disconnected, indifferent. The silence that he thought would protect him only painted him as cold. And then came the turning point. A reporter cornered Harry at a charity event in California. Microphones thrust into his face, cameras flashing, voices shouting. Will you return to Britain for your father? What do you think of William taking over? For a brief moment, Harry paused, his expression torn between anger and sorrow. He said only one line. My father deserves respect. That was it. But that single sentence set the world on fire. Was it support for Charles? Was it criticism of William? Was it a veiled attack on the palace? Analysts debated it endlessly. Some said it was Harry's way of siding with his father against the rush to crown William. Others said it was neutral, a son defending his father's dignity without picking sides. But either way, the silence was broken. And once broken, the flood could not be held back. Back in London, the palace braced itself. If Harry sided too strongly with Charles, it would deepen the family fracture. If he criticized William, it could spark an outright feud. If he attacked Camilla, it would throw fuel on an already raging fire. Harry's words carried weight far beyond California. And Meghan? She wasn't silent. Not entirely. Her allies in the press began floating stories, framing William's rise as rushed, Charles's treatment as cold, and Camilla's humiliation as karma. Every narrative Meghan pushed positioned her and Harry as sympathetic figures on the outside, watching a crumbling monarchy from afar. But the truth was far darker. Because Harry wasn't just a sideline prince. He was a potential threat. If he chose to speak fully, to reveal what he knew of palace dealings, he could destabilize the monarchy at its most fragile moment. And everyone inside Buckingham Palace knew it, which left William in a bind. How do you ascend to the throne while your brother, estranged, wounded, unpredictable, holds the power to undermine you with a single interview? It was a risk William couldn't ignore. And just as William began to find his footing, Meghan made a move that no one expected, a move that poured gasoline on the fire and turned Harry's silence into a weapon. Was Meghan Markle about to steal the spotlight in the middle of the monarchy's biggest crisis? That was the question blazing through every newsroom, every royal insider's WhatsApp group, every palace corridor. Because while William was being prepared to step into his father's role, Meghan was preparing something else entirely, her own narrative. And the timing couldn't have been more deliberate. Let's set the scene. The United Kingdom was in shock. Charles declared unfit. William thrust forward. Camilla humiliated. The monarchy divided. And in California, Meghan knew the world's eyes were locked on London. What better moment to strike? She began, as she always does, with the media. Reports surfaced that Meghan's PR team had quietly started briefing sympathetic journalists. Phrases like William's rushed power grab, Charles unfairly sidelined, and Harry excluded once again began appearing in glossy magazines and online columns. None of these stories bore Meghan's name directly. But the fingerprints were obvious. Now here's the irony. The public wasn't clamoring to hear Meghan's take. But she knew one truth. In the chaos of a monarchy in crisis, every narrative matters. If William appeared too eager, she could spin him as power-hungry. If Charles appeared too frail, she could paint Harry as the forgotten son robbed of his father's final years. If Camilla seemed humiliated, she could turn it into poetic justice, Diana's revenge from beyond the grave. Meghan didn't need to be in London. She just needed to shape the story. And shape it she did. Tabloids in the U.S. ran pieces quoting sources close to Meghan, suggesting that William had been waiting for this moment all along. He may play the dutiful son, one article read, but William has always known he would reign sooner rather than later. The implication was clear. William wasn't a reluctant heir. He was an ambitious one. Ask yourself this. Why float that idea now? Because Meghan knew perception is power. If she could plant seeds of doubt about William's motives, she could weaken his authority before it even solidified. And in doing so, she could elevate Harry, the prince painted as the loyal son, the one who cared about Charles, the one who said his father deserves respect. But this strategy came with contradictions. Meghan claimed to defend Charles, the same man she had accused of racist remarks and cruelty in past interviews. Was she now his champion? Or was she using his suffering as a tool to attack William? For critics, the hypocrisy was glaring. For Meghan, it was irrelevant. In media wars, consistency is a luxury. Timing is everything. Meanwhile, in Britain, the reaction was fierce. Headlines fired back. Meghan meddles again. Sussexes exploit royal crisis. Palace fumes over California interference. Palace aides, already overwhelmed with managing Charles's decline and William's rise, now had to brace for Meghan's shadow campaign. The fury inside those walls was palpable. And then came the twist. Meghan wasn't content with whispers and leaks. She appeared, publicly, deliberately, in front of cameras at a charity gala in Los Angeles. Dressed in flawless designer attire, smiling for photographers, she gave a short speech about resilience and leadership. She didn't mention William. She didn't mention Charles. She didn't mention the monarchy at all. But she didn't need to. The subtext was clear. Every image, every clip was framed as Meghan the leader, Meghan the strong voice, Meghan the alternative narrative to the drama playing out in London. For William, this was infuriating. He was fighting to steady the monarchy in its most fragile moment. And Meghan was turning it into a media circus, one she controlled from thousands of miles away. His advisors warned him, ignore her, don't give her fuel. But William knew the danger. Left unchecked, Meghan could sway public opinion, not just abroad but even in Britain, where anti-monarchy sentiment was always simmering beneath the surface. And what about Harry? He stood caught in the middle, yet again. His brief comment about his father deserving respect was now being weaponized by Meghan's allies. Did he mean to attack William? Did he mean to defend Charles? Or had Meghan spun his words for her own ends? Harry reportedly grew frustrated, telling friends that he wanted no part in a campaign against William. But by then, it was too late. The headlines had already written the story for him. The contradictions deepened. Meghan painted Harry as the dutiful son, yet the public remembered his explosive interviews accusing Charles of coldness and neglect. She framed William as ambitious, yet William had always projected reluctance about becoming king so soon. The truth became harder to find, buried beneath layers of spin. And here's the dramatic irony. Meghan may have thought she was destabilizing William, but in many ways, she was strengthening him. Britons who had once doubted William now rallied behind him, seeing Meghan's meddling as a threat to the monarchy itself. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace chanted his name, not Charles's, not Harry's. William's popularity soared even as Meghan tried to undercut him. But Meghan wasn't finished, because the biggest play wasn't in the press or on a red carpet. It was in a carefully timed sit-down interview she was planning, one that promised explosive revelations about the monarchy's handling of Charles's illness. An interview designed to dominate headlines, eclipse William's coronation preparations, and paint Meghan and Harry as the true victims of palace cruelty. And the palace knew, if Meghan spoke, the monarchy could be plunged into its darkest storm yet. Who actually approves a king's removal? That was the constitutional earthquake at the heart of the crisis. The palace had made its announcement, the doctors had signed their damning report, and William was already stepping into the role of sovereign-in-waiting. But in Britain, the monarchy is not just about crowns and ceremonies. It's about law, and the law runs through one institution, Parliament. Now pause here. Imagine the scene in Westminster. The House of Commons buzzing like a hive, MPs crowding the benches, journalists crammed into the press gallery, all waiting for the Prime Minister's words. Outside, protesters with placards waved Union Jacks, some cheering William's rise, others chanting, "Long live the King," meaning Charles, not William. Parliament was about to decide what few in history had ever been forced to confront. How do you legally sideline a reigning monarch? Let's rewind to precedent. The last time Britain faced this question was with George III, the so-called Mad King. His mental health had deteriorated so badly that Parliament passed the Regency Act, handing powers to his son. It was controversial, bitter, and humiliating. Now, more than 2 centuries later, history seemed to be repeating itself. Charles was alive, wearing the crown, but medically ruled unfit. That meant Parliament had to step in. Without their approval, William's rise had no legal teeth. And here's the drama. Not every MP agreed with the palace's narrative. Some saw Charles as frail, but not incapacitated. Others argued the monarchy couldn't afford uncertainty and must act decisively. It wasn't just a medical debate. It was a political war. The Prime Minister addressed the chamber with solemnity. "It is with regret that I inform this House of the Medical Council's unanimous decision." But was it unanimous? We already know whispers said otherwise. Yet the words spoken in Parliament carried authority, even if they masked deeper contradictions. The motion put before MPs was clear. Empower the Prince of Wales to act as regent, assuming the duties of the crown. The debate raged. One MP stood and declared, "We must not strip His Majesty of his dignity prematurely." Another countered, "The nation cannot have a monarch who is unable to govern." Back and forth, voices clashed, history trembled. Imagine watching from the galleries, hearing centuries of tradition collide with the urgency of the present. And outside, the people's voices were no less divided. Some shouted, "We want William." Others cried, "Support Charles." Hashtags trended both ways. Hashtag Long Live Charles versus hashtag King William Now. The monarchy, usually a symbol of unity, had become the subject of factional warfare. But here's where it gets even more tangled. Some MPs whispered that this wasn't just about health. It was about influence. William, they argued, would be far easier for the government to shape. A younger king, more pliable, less stubborn than Charles. Could it be that political ambition, not medical necessity, was steering Parliament's hand? The very thought sent shivers through those who remembered the monarchy's supposed independence. And yet, the machinery rolled forward. Committees met. Drafts of new regency legislation circulated. Lawyers parsed every word. Temporarily unfit versus permanently unfit. The language mattered, because in monarchy, words are weapons. One phrase could end Charles's reign forever. Another could leave the door ajar for his return. Meanwhile, William was caught in limbo. He couldn't fully act as king until Parliament confirmed it. He was the monarch in waiting, carrying the burden but not the crown. Imagine the torment of standing ready, the people already bowing, but knowing the law had not yet caught up. Kate, as always, played the role of steady anchor. She reminded William that Parliament's approval would come, that patience was strength. But William knew better than most. Politics moves slowly, and doubt spreads quickly. Every day Parliament debated was another day the monarchy looked fractured, and in the shadows, Camilla still whispered. Rumors spread that she had reached out to sympathetic MPs, urging them to delay, to resist, to question the doctor's judgment. Was she buying time? Was she hoping Charles might recover and reclaim his throne? Or was she simply desperate to keep William from eclipsing her entirely? Whatever the motive, her actions only deepened the divide. Now ask yourself, how fragile is a monarchy that depends on politicians' votes to confirm its ruler? The institution built on divine right, centuries of bloodline, reduced to parliamentary procedure. The irony is staggering. And then, just when the debates reached their boiling point, a bombshell hit. Leaked documents, not to the press, but to a select group of MPs. Papers suggesting that Charles's diagnosis wasn't as clear-cut as the palace claimed. That some doctors had argued he could continue in a limited role. Suddenly, Parliament wasn't just debating succession. They were debating whether they had been misled. The chamber erupted. Who knew what and when? MPs demanded. Was this about health? Or was it a coup dressed in medical robes? William sat in his private chambers, waiting for word, every tick of the clock heavier than the last. And then, late into the night, an aide rushed in with the news. Parliament's vote had swung, but not in the way anyone expected. Because instead of a clean endorsement of William's regency, they demanded a full inquiry.